Alright, it's time. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, we're talking about the new Orbital album, Optical Delusion. Well, we got a new Orbital album. I don't need to bother introducing Paul and Phil Hartnell to this channel's audience. We already know they're my favorite band of all time. They were the ones who first started my lifelong obsession with all things electronic music. I've spent so much time gushing about them over the years, and I could keep going on and on about them as long as I live. I personally don't think they've ever released a studio album that wasn't fantastic. My least favorite of their albums still got a score of an 8.5 out of 10 for me, and the entire channel is partially named after it. My history with Orbital is already extremely well documented. We all know this stuff. There's even a part of me who wishes I hadn't already gotten my discography review of them out of the way 5 years ago, since I could write those reviews even better now, but it is what it is. There's some of my few pre-2018 material that I still look back on and don't find cringeworthy. But now we got a new one that I've intentionally been sitting with for a couple of weeks to make sure my thoughts are completely solidified, and also so that I'd be able to hold up my CD copy over there in the video. While I'm always going to be really excited about any new release from Orbital, especially a new full-on studio album, I will also have to admit that the rollout behind this one did have me kinda worried, and I couldn't shake the feeling of something feeling a bit off about everything. First of all, there were the singles. They led off with Dirty Rat, a collab with Sleaford Mods going off on the Tory voters with a particularly punchy instrumental that happened to unintentionally release with the most perfect timing. I think it came out on the exact same day that Liz Truss resigned as Prime Minister. At first, I was really getting into it. It was great to have Orbital staying political and relevant, and the track was unsurprisingly a banger as well. But also, something wasn't quite right to me about it. I didn't really feel that strong an urge to come back to it all that much. The track almost felt too straightforward for my liking, and more like a solo Paul Hartnell track than a proper Orbital track. Instrumentally, it wasn't too far away from what Paul did for that one-off Heartwork single, albeit darker and with more bass guitar. Then they gave us the album opener, Ringa Ringa, the old pandemic folk song, which I also liked and didn't either grow or shrink on me the more I heard, but also right from the outset I wasn't quite sold on it thanks to how short and underdeveloped it was. And then for the third single, they showed their hand with the longest track in Are You Alive, which was finally properly great, but again wasn't even trying to hide its status as the solo Paul Hartnell effort, having been retooled from an instrumental that Paul originally made for the Hartnell and Young Virus Diaries project, specifically the track Garden Center, and turned into something that sounded a lot like certain tracks on Paul's 858 album, like The Past Now or Cemetery. I'll get into all of these more later on in the video. Now, all of this was well and good. I'll always enjoy me some solo Paul Hartnell, but I've never felt like Paul's solo material has ever fully been able to compete with the material he contributes to Orbital. I know Paul always came up with the majority of ideas behind Orbital tracks to start them off, and there's certainly a few scattered solo Paul tracks which can hit those amazing heights. Even certain Orbital albums that were mostly solo Paul, well, specifically Wonky, that he still got up to the lofty standard that I expect out of any Orbital project. But his work by himself is never going to be as strong to me as his work in collaboration with his brother. There too often feels like there's some integral part of the equation missing. That's also why their last album, Monsters Exist, has stuck with me and continued to hold up for me as well as it has. Paul and Phil were openly working together and playing their ideas off each other a lot more, and that led to a far denser and more interesting listening experience that rewarded you more and more the longer you sat with it. Optical Delusion, on the other hand, looked like it was going to follow more in the footsteps of what Paul did with 858. Even further confirmed when I got to see the list of credits and noted that Paul and Phil didn't work together on a single track on this album. Everything was solo Paul, aside from a handful of solo Phil cuts. And none of that is even to get into the weird rollout of the physical versions. It seems they've returned to the days of the Green Album, where there were several different versions with different track listings. Okay, like, unlike the Green Album, the core album here is at least the same 10 tracks every time, but there were, like, 5 different selections of bonus tracks added on to different releases of the album, be it adding on a bonus CD with a few alternate versions of the singles, including a track called Oxygen, which is really just a French version of Are You Alive. There was a digital deluxe version with 3 other bonus alternate versions of tracks that weren't the same as the ones on the above-mentioned bonus CD. There's the Amazon exclusive CD version that had 3 bonus tracks, which were all completely original tracks. This is the version I sprung for, and I'll get to those tracks later. There was a Blu-ray version that included the Amazon exclusive tracks and instrumental versions of all 13 cuts and a Dolby Atmos mix. And of course, most exclusive of all, there was a 100 copy limited release digital pressing partnered with Serenade, a supposedly eco-friendly NFT distributor. Which, no, fuck that. For what it's worth, I seriously doubt that's going to become a trend with them given their usual anti-capitalist stances. I can tell they were really just doing it out of delayed peer pressure, kind of like Amon Tobin did. I'm willing to gloss over it, but point is, all of this did nothing to alleviate my worried feelings about this album, and having to cancel and reorder my CD copy twice to make sure I got the bonus tracks I actually wanted was a little irritating too. But none of that was to say I wasn't still hopeful for this album anyway. First of all, because I was intrigued by what Phil's solo material was going to be like. He doesn't do stuff on his own nearly as much as Paul does. But also because I remembered the rollout to Monsters Exist and being worried about that album too. None of that album's singles were instant winners either, but all of them played way better in full album context, and my worries turned out to be totally unjustified. I was going into Optical Delusion with measured expectations, and there was a very strong likelihood that this would be my new least favorite of their albums, but again, given the standards I typically hold them up to, that's really not saying much. This album could be properly great and still not live up to what they had before because the bar is just that ridiculously high for them. And after hearing it and sitting with it for about 2 weeks, I'm quite happy to announce that Optical Delusion is in fact not my new least favorite of their albums. It was entirely able to stand up to that high bar I've always set for them in the past, and I think it's excellent. I'm not gonna say it's one of my new absolute favorites from them. Again, unreasonably high bar, and I will not be heartbroken if they never give me a 6th 9 out of 10 album. Most artists I like can only do that once or maybe twice in their life. I mean, I saw one outlet go as far as to call this one their best album since Insides, and I completely reject that notion out of hand. Mainly because saying that is definitely just a backhanded way to throw shade on the stuff they did after Insides, and I am so sick of people dismissing their material from the middle of nowhere onwards. All those albums are fantastic too, and I will not back down from that. Justice for the Altogether and the Blue album, they deserve so much better. But never mind that. Optical Delusion may be in the lower tier of their catalog for me, as I kind of expected, but it still maintains a more than respectable spot for me. I'd say it's better than the Green album, but not as good as the Blue album, which has been growing on me quite a bit as of late. Now, as usual, the album is proving to be a bit divisive among the core fan base, with lots of varied all-over-the-place takes, as there always are. Though for once I haven't seen any professional critics blasting it. Usually there's at least a handful who are like, oh, 5 out of 10, another in a string from a disappointing band who have no place outside the 90s or something like that. But this time around, I think I only saw like one outlet scoring it a 6, and all the others didn't go lower than a 7. There's way more of a consensus around this one, and I'm more than happy to see that. And that does kind of stand to reason, since this album is both the album that instrumentally sticks the most to the sounds they pioneered in the 90s, with stuff like the Green album, but it's also their most overtly and unignorably political yet in a way that's very easy to understand. Now sure, Orbital's music has always been very political, but in a way that you could ignore. I mean, you could theoretically listen to Snivelization without picking up on its anti-capitalist and anti-consumerist themes, or listen to Insides without picking up on its environmental message, or listen to Monsters Exist without picking up on its lambasting of current world leaders and the rise of modern fascism. Those themes are always there in such a way that will make perfect sense if you hear them, like, explain it in an interview, and sometimes you won't even need an explanation to get it. And the clever way they execute those themes purely through their instrumentals is one of the biggest reasons why they're my favorite band. But working within the realm of instrumental music does technically still mean there's only so much you can specifically communicate in a way that won't go over people's heads. With Optical Delusion, you can't ignore the messaging quite so easily, not just because of fairly unsubtle track titles like, you know, the old pandemic folk song, The New Abnormal, or Requiem for the Pre-Apocalypse that sure as hell aren't hiding what they're about. But also because of all the guest vocalists who deliver the messages to you directly in English in such a way that you can't miss. The vocals have definitely been a bit of a sticking point among the fans that hasn't been everyone's cup of tea. Orbital including guest vocalists may not be a new development, but this is the main album of theirs in which they're the most easily intelligible. There's no Alison Goldfrapp showing up to sing random gibberish. I personally wasn't put off by the vocalists at all. It's executed in the same way that Paul incorporated guest vocalists into his 858 album, and the messaging itself I obviously have no problems with. It's all the same themes that I mentioned them exploring in their previous albums. Modern society, the environment, etc. As well as the obvious looming theme of the pandemic and the anxiety of coming out of it, because of course. It's all as on point as I would hope for it to be. But all of this is exactly what I was expecting to hear out of this album. I'd already assumed this was what it was going to be like as it was rolling out. But what really made this album, what pushed it into the amazing territory that I hold all main Orbital albums to, instead of the less enthusiastic place on the side that I hold their solo work to, is the sequencing and flow of the whole project. In terms of sequencing and flow, Optical Delusion is easily their best since the middle of nowhere. Hell, in those specific departments, it might be their best behind the middle of nowhere. Or behind the Brown album. But even with that album, like, they don't commit to flowing every track into each other. They do it up through Remind and then have 3 tracks that are more disconnected. This album may not directly segue tracks into each other like the Middle of Nowhere and the Brown album do, but every single track feels like a logical continuation of the idea that came before it, and is placed in the exact spot in the album it needs to be in for it to hit in the most effective way. Kind of reminding me of the last Kelly Lee Owens album in that way. They have the sequencing on this thing down to a very exact science. And there was no guarantee that they'd be able to pull that off, given this is technically a split between just Paul solo material and Phil solo material. I was worried they weren't going to work well together, and it is certainly true that Phil's tracks are executed very differently from Paul's. We'll get to that later. But even with that in mind, it's abundantly clear that there was communication between them to make sure that their ideas still logically fit together and they were working towards building the same musical arc. And honestly, with the pandemic being such a present theme on this album, it makes splitting their styles feel thematically appropriate. It's more just something that kinda happened out of necessity from the circumstances we were all in, but they made the most out of. Optical Delusion isn't merely a random collection of their solo work as I feared it would be going into it. It deserves to be called an Orbital album. Granted, it is definitely sitting on a bit of a precarious line where if you change any element going into it, this would not work nearly as well for me as it does. The sequencing is fantastic, but this album is also very heavily dependent on it. All of these tracks are individually are at least good, but none of them would hit nearly as well if you take them out of context. The running theme of Paul's style being a bit too straightforward definitely plays into that, and it did lead to this album hitting a strict limit to how much it could grow on me and how deep I could dig into it. Also, I've seen some fans complaining about the vocals and saying they out to just keep instrumental versions of this stuff, and man, I have to entirely disagree on that point as well. I don't think this album would work nearly as well if you took the vocals out, since if you do that, most of this album would just end up sounding kind of like a cross between the deep cuts on Wonky and a more simplistic and watered-down take on the Green album. The tracks that are already instrumentals, or mostly instrumentals, would be fine, but the vocal tracks, get this, are kind of designed to have vocals on them. Which is to say, if you take them out, they'll feel awkward and empty, like something needs to go on top. It's why, for instance, on Monsters Exist, I prefer the original version of There Will Come a Time over the instrumental they included in that album's deluxe version. That track may still be my least favorite Orbital album closer, and Brian Cox's appearance may be a novelty that wears off, but the track doesn't work if you take him out. It was built around his voice, and cutting him out leaves too many weird empty spaces. Just the same, I fully believe Optical Delusion would be worse without the vocals. Also, I never had any problems with the vocals to begin with, where I'd even consider taking them out. And their addition is something that this album has that sets it apart from the other Orbital albums and gives it its own identity. Really not sure why those people are complaining beyond the shallow of idea of, oh, I just don't want an Orbital album with regular lyrics. They're fine, chill out. So anyway, how about those individual tracks? Well, as mentioned above, we start with Ringa Ringa, the old pandemic folk song featuring the Medieval Babes. On one hand, very solid opener. It takes an idea that I originally saw the title of and pictured some, like, weird, austere acoustic composition, kind of like those on Paul's Ideal Condition album, but instead gives you a very traditional Orbital mix of vocal chops, standard techno beats, fluttering melodic textures, and some particularly airy vocal performances. Very on brand. And the title turned out to indicate that this track was actually a clever flip and topical recontextualization of an old nursery rhyme, Ring Around the Rosie. Same tune that everyone's probably heard dozens of times as a kid, but reminding people of the roots where the tune originally came from, tying back a tissue, we all fall down to people dying of the Black Death. Can't possibly imagine why Paul might have been inspired to make a track like this in the early 2020s. It's very nice. It's also probably my least favorite track on the album, and I think it also beats out One Big Moment for my least favorite Orbital album opener to date. While I like the idea behind this track and think it sounds very nice, it is still unequivocally a good track, and again, not being better than the likes of Planet of Shapes, Way Out, The Girl with the Sun in Her Head, Transient, or The Mobius isn't actually saying much. But I could never get over the fact that this track doesn't really have anything to offer beyond its one core idea. It doesn't build upon it or develop it in any way, it just presents the one idea and immediately dips after an all too short 4 minutes. Hell, if I didn't know any better, I'd think this was Orbital's attempt to appeal to a TikTok kind of audience. What with the super short length, and especially the recent popularity of tracks that sample nursery rhymes. Now, obviously I seriously doubt that's actually what Paul had in mind when he made this. These guys are almost literally my parents' ages, and I can't possibly imagine them trying to build an audience on TikTok or going on there at all. I'm too old for that shit, and I'm in my late 20s. Regardless, the track still always strikes me as being kinda undercooked and a few steps away from basically just being an album intro. Even One Big Moment felt like a more epic and substantive way for Wonky to start, but again, the track is still nice. I still like it. Most of the other tracks on the album similarly tend to stick to one core idea, if maybe not feeling quite as blatantly scant. But thankfully, once again, it's the way the tracks themselves work off each other and build off their ideas that really makes up for it. For instance, the following cut, Day 1, featuring Dina Ipovic, feels like it picks up right from where Ringa Ringa left off, and drives it into new territory, taking some very simple synth arpeggios and some particularly propulsive beats, with Ipavic's vocals acting more as a bit of like background texture for flavor, kind of mimicking the opera singer that was sampled on Belfast a little bit. And again, that's pretty much all the track has going for it, maybe a few sharper leads here and there later on and some quieter breather moments, but the groove behind it goes really hard and totally pulls me along with it. If Ringa Ringa is just the intro, it feels like this is the point where the album really takes off and gets going. Side note, I was expecting this track to sound completely different thanks to hearing a few live sets around the height of the pandemic where they were demoing 2 new cuts. One untitled, which I'll get to, and another called One Day, which went full old school 90s house. One Day turned out to not make the album, presumably thanks to sample clearance issues, but hey, Day 1, this completely unrelated track which had almost the exact same title for some reason. That was not a disappointment either. It's probably even better, certainly makes for the perfect bridge between its surrounding singles and makes these first 3 tracks almost feel like a single mini-suite. When the next track starts, it feels like it fits perfectly, and had they decided to do a more direct continuous mix, that transition would have been completely seamless. But on that topic, the beneficiary of that transition is Are You Alive, featuring Penelope Isles. That was my easy favorite of the pre-album singles, and perhaps unsurprisingly ended up becoming my favorite track on the album overall. But that's not just because it's the only track to break 7 minutes and actually feel fully fleshed out like the best Orbital tracks are. Especially since fleshed out is definitely a relative term there. This isn't like a big complex album centerpiece or a long-form Orbital epic, not even on PHUK's level. The structuring still reminds me more of tracks on 858 than anything else, where it still feels like a regular pop or indie song with Paul's typical backing beats, and you don't even notice that it's longer than the other tracks at all. Paul's solo track, Cemetery, was exactly the same way. But it is still my favorite track here, just because the tune is great, and it's probably the catchiest track on offer here. The instrumental may have originally designed to back up Murray Lachlan Young's slightly inane poetry about pushing a trolley at a garden center, but it feels like it was always meant to house the voice of Lily Walter from the beginning. a bit of a reminder that Young was absolutely the part of Hartnell and Young that made that album not very good. Walter's lyrics about not wanting to get fucked in the working world are frankly a lot more on point and timelessly relevant. And of course that breakdown with all the more propulsive filtering about a 5-minute mark or so is probably the best part too. If there's any track from this album that ends up sticking with me as one of the best individual tracks they've done, it is this one. Even if I don't think this would make like my top 20, it feels like it could be like an honorable mention in that list or something. But that's all Paul's stuff. Next we get to the first Phil track, You Are the Frequency, featuring The Little Pest. I don't know who The Little Pest is. I cannot find any information about it, either like on streaming services or on Discogs or any of the usual places I check. I suspect it's either just Phil himself or it's Jimmy Day, a vocal producer who Phil apparently worked with on his tracks and who did some engineering on the Long Range album, but whatever. Now, the first time I heard this track, I was completely thrown off. Where Paul has seen fit to mostly strip his tracks down to the barest essentials, Phil's tracks throw a lot more at you. This track immediately hits you with all these vocal snippets that get harshly pitched up and down and run through vocoders that even get a little distorted and fuzzy in parts. It's a little bit of a whiplash at first, but once I got used to it, I noticed that once the groove actually kicks in on this one, it's basically picking it right up from where Are You Alive left off. Obviously made out of different elements. It's got a bit more of a shuffling and stomping down-tempo beat, some mildly aggressive dubstep bass wubbing, and some plinking synth melodies, even a few light house pianos later on, but moving at the same pace, in the same key, as if it was like a crazy out of left field change-up of the same track. The vocal snippets on this one and how harshly they get pitched up and down was definitely a bit of an acquired taste. But I eventually warmed up to it and just got into how raw the main groove was and how it brought a new twist to the sound of the album without feeling out of place. I also remembered way back in the corner of my mind that one EP he did with Long Range called Control Me, which sounded just like this. I had nearly forgotten that existed, but that was a fun little reminder of a particularly obscure Orbital-related gem. But anyway, Phil then hands the baton back over to Paul, who builds off his groove into The New Abnormal, the first regular old instrumental on the album, mixing some harsher synth chords, which aren't too texturally far away from some of the synths Phil was using at the end of the previous track, with some filtered vocal-like lead synths that definitely remind me of some of the sounds which were explored on Wonky. Now, I've gone back and forth with this track a lot since it's honestly probably the track that tends to least stick out to me among the track listing. Out of context, it sounds like any number of other post-2009 Orbital tracks without really having much of an identity of its own. And in context, it's basically just like a filler transitional device. I can't really call it a major favorite, but it is still a really nice track, and there are a lot of cool progressions and phases it goes through over its short 5 minutes, including some sections where the synths really build up to this really triumphant effect, other moments where the track nearly stops dead in a way that still feels totally natural, a nice breakbeat focus section at the end too. And once I thought about it, the track actually does embody the title very well, being symbolism for how we're just carrying on with our lives post-pandemic, but nothing is quite exactly the same. There's still strangeness going on in the background, but we've just kind of gotten used to it. Really subtle idea, but one that crept up on me the more I sat with it. Definitely has its place in the context of the album. Next up, it's time for another vocal track in Home with Anna B. Savage. Sonically, honestly, there's not much to note about this one. It's kind of just the standard Orbital sound with some techno beats, a little bit of acid synths in the background, and the voice of Anna B. Savage is kind of just generically like the other female guest singers on the album. Maybe a tiny bit deeper, but not that striking. It pretty much just sounds like Are You Alive Again without the more propulsive parts. But what got this track to really stick out was the lyrics, which deliver a particularly direct and bleak environmental message, lamenting the various ways that humans have ruined the planet we live on, climate change, plastic trash everywhere, displacing animal populations, etc., and longing to find another place to call home. Even imagining a fantasy scenario where cities are torn down and reclaimed by nature so that the planet can heal without human intervention. I don't think Anna B. Savage is actually trying to float that as a literal solution to the world's environmental problems, more just kind of fantasizing and moping about how far we've gone and the damage the human race has already done. It's very striking and descriptive in its language, and very bleak and sad as any artist would be trying to tackle environmental issues in 2023. But the very depressing subject matter is, I guess, lightened somewhat by the tune itself, which, while still suitably melancholy, is quite catchy in its own right. But while we're on the topic of getting very on the nose and delivering blunt political messages, next is the lead single, Dirty Rat with Sleaford Mods. Right before the album came out, this was my least favorite of the 3 singles for reasons I outlined earlier in the video. Just something didn't hit quite right about it and made me not really wanting to come back to it. And perhaps since I'm American, there may have been like a quick reflexive thought about how going off on the voting public wouldn't be the best move if, say, we were talking about our last presidential election. Like, sure, we may have a really mediocre white guy in office right now who is absolutely worth criticizing for lots of various reasons, but electing him in was the only way to keep out a literal white supremacist lunatic who would have done a million times worse. We were pretty much given a choice between peace and annihilation, which Orbital already have an appropriate track for. But that reflexive thought would be a really stupid criticism because Orbital and Sleaford Mods are obviously British, not American. And Dirty Rat has nothing to do with America at all. It is very specifically about the UK, about the middle-class white people who keep voting in Tories because they blame the world's problems on anyone who doesn't look like them. Blaming immigrants and poor people and transgender people, hoping to keep pushing down on anyone who isn't well off or looks like a fried animal instead of the rich people actually widening the wealth inequality gap and lying politicians actually causing the problems. And that is a much better justified target to go off on. Also, to be fair, we do still have lots of people like that in America too, and a lot of ours are even worse. Not being relative to one specific election we had semi-recently certainly doesn't mean this track won't ever be relevant to us as well. Out of the 3 pre-album singles, this was easily the biggest grower out of all of them after the album actually came out. It's still not a track that I think has enough to it where I'd want to come back to listen to it all by itself, but it is again placed in the exact perfect spot in the album to hit with the greatest and most satisfying possible impact. Perfectly contrasting the depressing environmental cut with all this righteous visceral anger, a burst of energy and a total shift towards all these punchier and grittier textures right when they're most needed, and also marking a major turning point in the tone of the album as well, where things start to get a lot less sweet and a lot more dark and freaky. Enter the next track, Requiem for the Pre-Apocalypse, the other all-instrumental cut, and this is where shit really starts to go off the rails. Paul goes full drum and bass in a track that wouldn't have felt out of place on the Altogether, and I mean that as the highest possible compliment. You got all these skittering and slamming percussion patterns flying past you at high speed, unnerving bass rumbles and slightly off-key vocal pads getting chopped up, some whirs and crashes that remind me a lot of some sounds that show up on old tracks like Tension and especially Meltdown. But as dark and chaotic as the track starts, there's suddenly a whole middle section where the mix opens up into all these gorgeous melodic pads and arpeggios. Unlike the new Abnormal, which I went back and forth with a lot, this one was instantly a favorite from the first time I heard it and stayed that way on all subsequent listens. It is great to hear Orbital trying some of these more experimental flares again. But if you thought this track was nuts, it's absolutely nothing compared to what comes after it. Phil is tasked with ending the album in the final 2 tracks, and he's seen fit to close the project out on a completely unhinged, chaotic mindfuck. I suppose that stands to reason to follow a Requiem for the Pre-Apocalypse with 2 tracks that may as well symbolize the apocalypse. But even with that in mind, nothing could have prepared me for how completely nuts these last 2 cuts are. What a Surprise featuring The Little Pest starts out by hitting you with all these various unstable clanging synths, and a minute in, rapidly switches over into all this thunderous stabbing synth bass going over a bombastic trap beat that sounds like Chief Keef or Meek Mill could have gone over it a decade ago, filling out the mix with tons of completely indecipherable half-whispered vocal snippets shooting off in every direction, pitching themselves up and down, chopping them up into tiny fragments, and barely even aligning themselves to the rhythmic grid. The mix is way too cluttered to make out most of what's being said, aside from maybe one snippet saying the title and another saying, "I have been radicalized." After this track finished for the first time, I felt like I had to do a bit of a double take from how completely off the chain things just went, and needed a moment to process what just happened. But Phil isn't interested in giving me that break. He instead ends the album on the less bombastic but equally freaky and dense Moon Princess, featuring Japanese singer and electronic producer Kopei. Her deeper-voiced, off-kilter vocals are only the tip of the iceberg and frankly get a little drowned out in how clever the mix is in some parts and how much there is to pay attention to. She's sharing space next to several layers of synth blips, a slightly unsteady disco-y percussion loop, various vocal chops that pitch her voice way down, unrelated spoken word snippets talking about trying to make rational decisions despite existing in an irrational universe, and you have to find your own meaning in life. I guess that ties into what he was doing with You Are the Frequency. And of course, there's the whole gritty acid breakdown in the middle as well, and only then did I hear Kopei actually singing Princess of the Moon and remind me of why that track was actually called that. And then it just kind of ends. The album finishes on by far its two most out there experimental moments, two of the most out there experimental tracks I've ever heard out of Orbital to date, and makes no attempt to leave you on any kind of resolution or closure. Just an acknowledgement that the world as we once knew it has gone completely mad and we have to just do our best to deal with it. First time I heard this album, this ending had completely overshadowed all the different all over the place thoughts I had on the rest of the project, and all I could think of to say was, holy shit, Phil. Now, in one breath, I have seen a lot of people highlighting Phil's tracks as their least favorite part of the album, and I do get why. They are a bit on the garish and unpleasant side, and their mixes are so cluttered with so much random shit going on that it's hard to make heads or tails of anything. And again, that approach might feel a little out of place, trying to fit next to Paul's way simpler arrangements. But first of all, I imagine not being able to make heads or tails of anything was exactly the point of the last two tracks in particular. They were meant to be a total clusterfuck from the start, and Paul at least did a good job of making sure it didn't come completely out of left field by escalating the chaotic tone of the tracks leading up to it. But I also gotta respect how much of a weird risk it was to end the album on such a completely unhinged and unresolved note, and their sheer uncompromising weirdness kept growing on me more and more every time I put the album on, and I was slowly able to wrap my head around what he was doing. Also, as someone whose all-time favorite album closer is 808 State's Banachek, I'm always game for a good mindfuck ending if it's executed this well. Paul's tracks on this thing are easy to compare to lots of other older moments on Orbital albums, but Phil's tracks are unlike anything else in their catalog. Even unlike the work Phil's been involved with outside of Orbital. Not that we get to hear Phil on his own very often to begin with. He had his above-mentioned work in Long Range with Nick Smith, which had one album and one EP, but that's pretty much it. So I'm more than happy to get more insight into his side of the Orbital creative process, and I do once again think his contributions worked into the album and added to the experience quite well without feeling out of place. But while that's where the standard edition of the album ends, that's not quite everything on Optical Delusion. We have to talk about bonus tracks too. Now, I'm not going to do an in-depth breakdown of all the different bonus tracks and all the different versions of the album, because the vast majority, as mentioned above, are just alternate versions of tracks already on the standard edition, and that's not really interesting enough to mention. But what is important to mention is the bonus tracks exclusive to the Amazon CD and the Blu-ray versions. 3 entirely new tracks called The Crane, Year of the Bat, and Lost in Time. The former 2 are Paul solo tracks, and the latter one is Phil solo. I specifically sprung for the Amazon CD so that I would be able to hear these tracks. Now, at first I wasn't exactly jumping with excitement to hear these 3 tracks. I'd seen a couple of people say that they thought these bonus tracks were even better than the stuff on the main album, which at first I just took with a grain of salt, cause I remembered the deluxe edition of Monsters Exist had a whole section of 6 original bonus tracks that a few fans said they liked more than the main album, but I didn't agree at all. I thought that album's bonus tracks were just that album's cutting room floor and all unfinished and unpolished demos. And the people saying the unfinished demos were better felt kinda like they were just making backhanded comments against the stuff that actually made the cut. I kind of figured these 3 new tracks were going to be the same deal, but as I heard more people talking about the bonus tracks on this album and how they actually should have been on the album alongside the rest of it, hearing more and more people highlighting them in particular, it got me curious. So I ended up getting a little impatient and torrenting them so that I could listen to them without having to wait 2 weeks for my CD to arrive. And after hearing them, actually turns out these cuts lived up to the hype. I don't know if I'd go as far as to say they'd be the best part of the album if they were included. If they are, it wouldn't be by a long shot or anything, but there's way more of a solid case for people to say that than I expected. All three can count as favorites if they're included in the track listing. They're just as well polished as the stuff on the main album, actual tracks instead of just demos. And even better, they also feed into the album's pitch-perfect sequencing and give the album a proper ending with actual sense of resolution and closure. Right from the first few seconds I hit the play button on the crane, I heard those pianos coming in and immediately recognized it as that untitled track I mentioned from their Pandemic live set that also had One Day. I was like, oh, it's this one! I know this one! And got really excited. It's a really freaking good track. A bit of a melancholy down-tempo cut with some nice piano chords and moody electro beats. Some melodies being formed out of the pitching this metal squeaking sound up and down. Also another vocal appearance from Dina Ipovic, which feels like a more upfront version of the performance Lisa Gerrard contributed to One Perfect Sunrise, or maybe even like Alison Goldfrapp on Nothing Left. It sounds lovely, nails its mood very well, very easy to get into. Year of the Bat, meanwhile, has no vocal guest, but appears to be the fan favorite of the three bonus tracks, and again, I can see why. It's a much more propulsive blend of melodic synth arpeggios that kind of reminds me of Paul's 858 track Nearly There, but even more epic and triumphant. All these synth washes sound really huge and expansive, and the bass lines and marching electro beats really get you pumped up. Definitely the kind of thing that can speak to any Orbital fan on a deep, visceral level. And then finally, Phil is tasked with ending the album once again in Lost in Time, though with this cut he restrains himself way more, delivering a super chill and spacey mix of melancholy synth pads, plinking melodic blips and arpeggios, maybe a few vocal samples saying anytime, or even some MIDI clarinets for good measure. Actually kind of reminds me of Paul's 858 track, Broken Up, weird as it is to say. It's not flashy or over the top at all, like his ending to the standard edition. It might actually be the most subtle cut in the bunch and just has a very simple, distant emotional quality to it. I might admittedly slightly prefer the total unresolved mindfuck ending. Not enough albums end like that, and this is definitely way more of a traditional album closer. Also, it doesn't approach being an all-time standout on the level of a Halcyon Out There Somewhere, Attached, One Perfect Sunriser style. Again, bit of a high bar there. But this is a satisfying and subtly refreshing finish all the same. It carries a similar mood to There Will Come a Time, except not built with overlaying Brian Cox's narration in mind. And honestly, I've just started to include these bonus tracks on the end of the main album on my iPod anyway, since they fit so well. The album doesn't absolutely need these last three tracks to work, but they are more than worthy to add on to the experience and make the album feel even more complete. And that is finally everything on Optical Delusion. What a trip this has been. Can you tell I like this band? I have absolutely been mentally wrestling with this thing a lot for the past 2 weeks, and I'm not gonna pretend I'm not still a little conflicted on it. It is definitely cool to hear Paul and Phil's creative processes distilled apart from each other, but for the Orbital equation to fully work, you need Paul and Phil working together, not separately like they were here. That's why I'm a lot happier with this album as it comes together as a complete, unbroken whole than I am with any of the individual parts that go into it. I don't think this album has any single big new favorite track from them overall. Are You Alive is the only one that even kind of approaches that, and even that one's not in the same conversation as my favorite highlights on Monsters Exist, like The End Is Nigh or PHUK. Thing is, if you take any of the 13 tracks on this album as individuals, they're not really Orbital tracks. They're solo Paul Hartnell tracks and solo Phil Hartnell tracks. And again, you're not quite going to get the Orbital magic if you treat them as disconnected islands. Where the Orbital magic comes in is, again, how each track feeds into the next one and directly contributes to the overarching flow and arc of the album, each cut just a chapter in one big unspoken narrative. And the fact that Paul and Phil felt like they had to actively work together to get these tracks to fit so cohesively together, that is why this album still unquestionably feels like a real Orbital album, despite a lot of the tracks not entirely feeling like real Orbital tracks. Is this album going to work as well for someone who isn't as deeply invested in Orbital as I am? Maybe? I don't know. No Orbital album is truly capable of satisfying everyone. There's always going to be people who think The New Thing is one of their best, and people who think The New Thing is one of their worst. There's an easy case to be made in either direction here. But I would still recommend it to people in case you end up in the former category. I obviously put it above Wonky, the merely very good to almost great album that is only made amazing by its final two tracks. And I put it above the Green album, which showed them a little more in prototype form without really having the greater focus they had later on, rising above what was trendy on their then underground scene, even while they were pioneering it. But I do not put it above the Blue album, which has all my childhood nostalgia packed into it. And quite frankly, the individual tracks on that one still feel a little better fleshed out, more complex and unique, and better able to stand on their own than those on here. But this album does have its own special qualities that still makes me feel it's worthy of holding close to me, just like all of Orbital's other albums are. I like that Orbital aren't afraid to keep trying new things and make sure each album isn't made redundant by one of their others, and it's probably going to end up on my year-end list anyway, because of course it is. I seriously doubt it's going to end up as my favorite album of the whole year. Can definitely see more stuff coming along to beat it out. And even if I can't reasonably expect it anymore, I'm still going to have my fingers crossed for them to eventually decide to start making big long 10-minute behemoths again someday. But at the end of the day, even Orbital's simplest and most straightforward album yet still got me to nerd out over it for over a half hour straight, so clearly it's doing something right. So I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, the link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.